Thank you. Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. I know this is a small room, but they need the microphone on for the recording, so I'm going to leave it on. But is this level okay for everyone? Other than that, you can hear. Okay. Yeah, that's a great idea. It's wonderful to be back. I think I was saying to someone else that the last time I was here, I think it was the hottest day in New York's history. So it's kind of nice to be back. Even though we're kind of complaining about the cold, it's nice to be back here in more temperate times. And this book, Emerging Metropolis, is actually part of a 3-part series on the history of New York City that just came out this September, or last September. And it's edited by Deborah Dashmore, who's a scholar of American Jewish history. And there are 4 different authors who have worked on this project. The first book is A Haven of Liberty by Howard Rock, and that talks about New York history, New York Jewish history from 1654 into the 1860s. Then my book, which I co-wrote with Daniel Sawyer, a professor of history at Fordham University, overlaps and starts in 1840 and goes to 1920. And the third book is by Jeffrey Gurak, a professor of American Jewish history at Yeshiva University, and it's called Jews of Gotham, and that's 1920 to the present, roughly. In addition, each book has a section that was curated, I guess is the right word, by an art historian who picked all sorts of images and did a kind of visual look at the time periods discussed in the book. So there are many authors and many voices that went into the creation of this series, and I think that is very New York in a way. So if you imagine a typical New York conversation with people interrupting each other, people having different ideas, part of that, I think, is captured in the book and in the series as a whole. But today I'm just going to talk about one of these books, the one I co-wrote with Danny Sawyer. And it is called Emerging Metropolis. It begins in 1840, goes to 1920, and it really deals with New York as under the age of immigration and looks at how New York becomes more of a Jewish city in this time. So to begin today, we talk about this in the introduction of our book. This is a Passover Seder at Ellis Island. And this is from the early 1900s. And we used to illustrate a newspaper article that we had found in the Morgen Journal, which was a Yiddish newspaper, talking about Jewish immigrants, East European Jewish immigrants who had arrived at Ellis Island, but 160 of them were detained. Probably they arrived too late to be processed. We're not sure. But they were detained, and they happened to be detained on the night of the Passover Seder. So even as, and New York Jews knew this might happen, so the Jews who were already in New York, basically as the ship was coming in, bringing the East European Jews over, there were East European Jews who had already been in New York 10 years, 15 years. They're on a boat coming towards Ellis Island to create a Passover Seder for these detainees. And it's really a lovely moment to think about. And one of the kind of the cohort of people who went to create the Passover Seder for these immigrants was a man named Yaakov Pfeffer, and he was a journalist for the Morgen Journal, for the Yiddish newspaper. And he wrote about it the next day, or probably the day after the holiday was over, and talked about, he said this: when the future historian tells the story of the freedom of the Jewish people, when that person has the good fortune to tell not only of the sorrows, but also of the joys of the Jewish nation, he will need to tell of the Seder night on Ellis Island. And what he did is he compared these immigrants arriving off the boat, having this Passover meal, he compared them to the Israelites who had fled Egypt. So in that comparison, the Pharaoh, the early 20th century version of the Pharaoh was, of course, the Tsar, and these immigrants were like the Israelites fleeing, and America, and New York specifically, had become the promised city, or the promised land. So very monumental. And the Jews who celebrated the Seder had arrived at the crest of a century-long wave of Jewish immigration that had begun in the 1840s, chiefly with Jews who had come from Central Europe. So often German-speaking Jews, often many of them spoke Yiddish as well, some of them. And they were leaving because of economic change in their European homelands. And they were driven out of their accustomed trades. And along with political religious persecution, that sent them in search of new livelihoods. And the United States in the 19th century, and especially New York, needs workers, needs laborers. So it was this perfect match, in a way, of these immigrants leaving and arriving in the United States. As I said, in the early years, 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, yeah? The picture, we don't have a date. The date is from the first decade of the 20th century, but there wasn't an exact date. The date of the Passover Seder I'm describing is 1906, April 10th, 1906. Which also happened to be 2 days after my great-grandmother had arrived. So I thought there was something really exciting about finding this piece. But the symbolism was really important because the symbolism of the Passover Haggadah and the story of freedom really matched what was happening there. Throughout the century, many of these Jewish immigrants arriving through the port of New York, whether it was Castle Garden in the mid-19th century and later Ellis Island after 1892, many of them stayed in New York. So what did they find there? This book is called City of Promises. So we wanted to, what did New York promise these immigrants? It promised them freedom, as we've talked about with the Passover Haggadah in a way. But freedom of what? Freedom for what? And how did this kind of play out as they came? That journalists had noted that Ellis Island itself was the, quote, the border between the land of Gullus. Gullus is exile, so it's border between the land of exile and the land of freedom. And they were leaving the shadow of exile and the shadow of persecution for the freedom and safety of America, and that represented a new chapter in Jewish history. Now, of course, there were periods of freedom and promise in Europe in different places at different times, but there was something about New York that these people are noting even at the time that offered up something different. One of the things about New York in this time is that the Jewish population grows so much, and there was something about the sheer numbers of Jews in the city that allowed for a diversity of Jewish expression, a diversity of identity. And just to kind of back that up with some numbers, in 1840, the Jewish population in New York was 7,000, 1880, 80,000, 1900, 500,000. The eve of World War I, 1.1 million, and by 1920, 1.5 million. So this is becoming, in this time period, New York becomes the largest Jewish city, not just in the United States, but the largest Jewish city in the world. And so that the sheer numbers, and combined with the freedom and the opportunity, allow for a diversity of expressions. One of the things that was also really important to us as we stepped back and we thought about this time period was that the majority of Jews at any given time in New York in this century were working class and were immigrants. So when you said, often people discuss what is a New York Jew, and what I say to them, a New York Jew, it depends what year, what decade, and even what year you're asking that question. When we're thinking about these immigrants, you have to understand that New York was, for these Jews, for the most part, working class. Now, even as immigrants ascended up a ladder, and I'll talk about that, even as people moved uptown, they became merchants instead of peddlers, often their Jewish identity was framed around the fact that there were new Jews arriving who were taking the place of those who had moved up, and that their responsibility as communal leaders was to somehow take care of these new Jews who were arriving. So this working class population is continually replenished over the course of the century. One of the other things we wanted to do in this book is talk about the space of New York City and understand the buildings. For me, let me actually stop for a second and ask you, how many of you are born and bred New Yorkers? Okay, so how many of you came to New York as an adult? Okay, great. So I'm among the second group of people, so I want to out myself as a Milwaukeean right now. And at first that kind of intimidated me. I had a long career in New York. When I went to graduate school at Columbia, I worked for a company called Big Onion Walking Tours, leading walking tours. And how many of you have been on a Big Onion walking? Okay. So the brilliant creation of Seth Campbell, who is still running this wonderful company, allowing graduate students an opportunity to get out on the streets of New York and talk about, what you see in front of you. So that was so important to me, shaping the way that I approach the city, shaping my career. That I wanted to try to infuse this book in some ways and talk about buildings and talk about spaces. Because for me, I learned about New York, not just from texts, not just from reading Yiddish newspapers, but also just by walking in these cities and looking at these buildings or reading these buildings. And my career after a walking tour guide and after finishing my dissertation was at the Museum of Aldridge Street, the Aldridge Street Synagogue, a National Historic Landmark, and now at the Tenement Museum. So my day-to-day life is interpreting history history through space. And what we wanted to do in writing this book was, as much as possible, to talk about buildings. Now, in the early years of the Jews in New York City, in the 1840s and 1850s, so the early years of this book, there weren't that many Jewish buildings. These, as I said earlier, these were poor people arriving. Many of them would become peddlers. Actually, for a period of time, about 1/3 of the new arrivals, 1/3 to 1/2, depending on which source, says that Jews start off as peddlers when they arrive. So peddlers going door to door, going off into the smaller areas and then returning for more goods and going out again. But they're starting out as peddlers. They don't have the means or the time to construct a grand building. Now, let me ask you this: if you would think, even today, thinking about New York, and if you were having a visitor come to New York to see you, what buildings would you show them to kind of say that New York is a Jewish city? Mm-hmm. Synagogues, and
well, I was just going to say Temple Manual.
Great, Temple Manual. Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying this to patronize you.
Mm-hmm.
I would take them to the Tenement Museum.
Oh, good.
The one that I ran with my parents, it was probably about 5 years ago when they were already in their 80s, up the stairs.
Excellent. So that's wonderful to hear. So that the synagogues and the tenements are places, and we talk about both in the book. So, and we talk about others as well. But in the early years, in the 1840s and 1850s, these Jews who are arriving, most of them are living in tenements. They're living in buildings that have been subdivided, or actually were built with different separate apartment spaces, but are crammed into buildings in some of the neighborhoods around here. Mm-hmm. And Ellis Island is another space to take people, which we talk about in the introduction as well. So excellent. So all these places are important to kind of understand New York, and especially about Ellis Island, understand that Jewish history was part of this immigration. And the port of New York is incredibly important for understanding Jewish history. And I would add to that the Statue of Liberty, which becomes, in 1904, I believe, when Emma Lazarus's poem is attached to the pedestal of Statue of Liberty. It's this wonderful moment where a Jewess has kind of remade even the meaning of the statue, with giving it this sense of New York as an immigration center, and New York as an immigrant city. So all of this neighborhood that we're in today, and a little bit actually west of here, was a neighborhood called 5 Points. Actually, I think I have a picture. Oops. Oh, sorry, I did it. Okay, so this is 5 Points. A few east of here, thank you. I'm thinking of being at the tenement. When I'm at the tenement, it's west. Here it's east. I'm probably more west than I usually am. So the 5 Points was an immigrant neighborhood. It was not a Jewish neighborhood per se. In fact, most of the residents were indeed immigrants, but often Irish immigrants or the children of Irish immigrants, and a smaller portion were German immigrants. And of those German-speaking immigrants, about half of them in the 1860s, 1850s, 1840s were Jewish. So you have this diverse immigrant neighborhood. Now, there's no Jewish buildings, very few Jewish buildings, because they don't have the resources to build. So someone arriving, a new immigrant arriving, is going to walk these streets and not necessarily see a Jewish presence. But the immigrant who hangs around and meets up with friends and becomes in the know will know that walking down these streets, oh, if you go up the stairs, that's where Gittel Nadelson lives, and she makes wigs for women who want wigs. Or if you're not married, then she'll find a match for you. Or if you go to 52 Mott Street, that's where Henry L. Goldberg lives, and he's a scribe. And if you need something scribed, you can go to him. And also, there were kosher butchers, but and in the early years, the kosher butchers were connected to some of the synagogues. But in this time, and we write about this as well, the kosher butchers kind of leave the scope of the synagogue and strike out on their own as businessmen. So that's exactly, you'd be going to stores maybe to get a sense of Jewish presence. So what we argue in our first chapter is that yes, there are synagogues, but a lot of Jewish life is lived outside of the synagogue, sometimes in saloons. Now, why saloons? Well, the rear of a saloons were often built with a back room that clubs rented out. So has anyone ever heard of B'nai B'rith, for example? B'nai B'rith is a Jewish fraternal organization started in 1843 on Essex Street in the back of Sinsheimer's Saloon. So this was very, very common that there'd be these signs of Jewish activity in the street, in stores, not necessarily where you would expect if you think I want to find the synagogue. Now, there were synagogues, and there were about the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th synagogues in New York were created in 5 Points. And what they would often do is rent a room or rent a space, and after a while save up the money to build. Some built right away, but most of them had to wait to do this. When 5 Points is the actual, the question is, where is 5 Points? The intersection of what is now Park and Worth and Baxter Street. So if you know where Mulberry Park is, or it's also called Columbus Park, at the base of it is where those three streets intersect. But the neighborhood, the broader neighborhood, kind of expands around Canal and Mott and Mulberry and Baxter Street and Bayard Street and Chatham. And Chinatown, exactly. 5 Points is Chinatown. Thank you. So I just want to go back for a second. Could you go, hit back just to this, yeah. Excellent. Okay, so this is a picture from 1878, and this is a depiction of Chatham Street. And Chatham Street where a lot of Jewish salesmen had opened used clothing stores. So what's going on in this picture? Yes?
Something that my husband told me used to go on with him when he went to the Lower East Side to shop with his father. The man is pulling the thing tight in the back to try to make it seem that it fits.
Yes, exactly. So, yes. So I'm going to read, this is one of the ways that historians now look for kind of what was going on in New York in the 1840s, 1830s, 1850s. A lot of travelers would come to New York and describe different neighborhoods. This particular one is by a man named George Carver. These were initially published in the Tribune, actually, and were later published in full form. I'm just going to read a section of it. It's describing Chatham Street in the late 1840s, but I think even though this picture comes later, it speaks to that. For the greater portion of Chatham Street, clothing stores line the southern sidewalk without interruption, and the coattails and pantaloon legs flap about the face of the pedestrian, like the low branches in a wood path. In front of each, from sunrise to sundown, stands the natty, black-bearded, and fiercely mustached proprietor, every now and then venturing when a countryman passes to tap him delicately on the arm and invite him to look at the magnificent assortment of wares and wearables within. Stooping, as you enter the low, dark doorway, you find yourself in the midst of a primitive formation of rags, carefully classified into vests, coats, and pantaloons, and each neatly labeled. The clothing shops are invariably kept by Jews. A Yankee shopkeeper in Chatham Street could not exist. It is a physical impossibility. The Jew is gentle, he is insinuating, somewhat even polished, knows at a glance whether you are from the country or the city, whether you have a monkeyish taste for finery and gewgaws, or want something rough and substantial. He is, too, a great artist, especially in coats. You may have experienced some difficulty and vexation in getting your tailor to fit you. Pshaw. Step into the nearest clothing store at Chatham Street and slip on a coat, any coat, and we'll wager our wedding suit that it is a splendid fit. There is no such thing as an ill-fitting coat in Chatham Street. Every coat there fits everybody. After you get it home, your wife or friends may discover that it appears to have been made for the alderman of the ward, but then it can easily be taken in. And in fact, coming from Chatham Street, there is no wonder that it took you in first. So now keep in mind the tone of that. Every neighborhood that this this writer describes has this, stereotypes and everything built in. So that was kind of the part of the approach. But it is showing the way in which Jews are going into the used clothing business. And that, it starts very humble. But by 1888, one observer charted Broadway Street between Canal and Union Square and found that almost every store, every cast iron building had a Jewish business in it. So starting out small, starting out on Chatham Street in this not so exciting or not so glamorous setting, but worked them into businesses. And eventually these dry goods businesses also then go into the broader garment industry. So in the 19th century, most people get their clothes done by a tailor, and ready-made clothing, so clothing you'd buy already made, was only really that was sent to the South for slaves or to sailors or out west for miners. People didn't wear that. But some of these dry goods merchants would be making these in the back room and sending them off to the South and selling it that way, kind of starting a business on the side. And when the Civil War came and there was such a demand for uniforms, a lot of Jewish immigrants, or by then the children sometimes of some of these immigrants, got into the manufacturing of uniforms. And this whole idea of standardized sizing took shape because you couldn't possibly, you needed standardized sizing to create as many uniforms in such a short amount of time. And that then was applied to ready-made clothing. And so the garment industry exploded. And so these Jews who had started off in this less glamorous position were well poised and took advantage of the changes to make the garment industry the largest industry in New York City. And that is also then going to affect their relationship with incoming East European Jews who are arriving. And even as these Central European Jews now have their businesses along Broadway and they've left Orchard Street and Delancey Street and they've moved uptown, the East European Jews are going to take their places in what was in 5 Points and then what had been Klein Deutschland, or the German-speaking neighborhood, which becomes the Jewish Lower East Side. So the garment industry in some ways becomes a way for these people to propel themselves out from Chatham Street and onto Broadway. Now, most people don't jump from Chatham Street to Broadway. It could take a generation, not necessarily, but there was mobility. And this is one observer noted about the trajectory of a peddler, of these people arriving. And this is from the Asmonean, which was the first Jewish weekly, the first Jewish newspaper, and written in English. When the newly arrived Israelite asks what he shall do to make a living, he is most commonly advised to go and peddle. Accordingly, a basket is hastily fixed up, and he is hurried into the country. The country merchants receive them coolly and oppose step by step. An acrimonious feeling takes hold of the peddler's heart. He is disappointed and discouraged, and yet he goes from day to day, changes the basket for the bundle for the horse and wagon peddling, and finally emerges a sleek, thrifty merchant. Have the history of one of these men, and you have them all. So that there is this kind of mobility offered through peddling that East European first Central European Jews and then East European Jews go into. Now, when I had shown you that picture of 5 Points, and I noted there weren't that many buildings built as Jewish buildings, on 207 Canal Street, which isn't far from here at all, there was a man named Newman Cohen, and he had a glass business. Now, one of the things he did is as new immigrants arrived, they were told, oh, go find Newman Cohen, and he fitted them up with a basket of glass. And he gave them, cover this area, go into this part of the country and sell this area. Someone else comes in, tells them another area. So he helps them get started. But of course, if they do well, then they come back and they get another thing of glass, and he's expanding his business. So many of these immigrants arrive, they help out each other, but that also helps expand their businesses. What he also does is every month, every Jewish month, so the Jewish calendar is being observed because the first of Rosh Chodesh, the first of the Jewish month, he gives out charity. So people would know to go to 207 Canal Street and receive charity. So a lot of these institutions are kind of happening even though you can't see them because they're hidden in commercial spaces like the butcher store perhaps, like the glass house, or the back of a saloon. And you had your question?
You were talking about taking these goods to the country. What was considered the country?
Oh, that's a good question. So the question is, what would be considered the country outside of New York? I mean, it could be a little bit the Bronx or a little bit further out. And actually, Hazia Diner, who is a professor at New York University and has written probably 27,000 books. Exactly. Her next project is on the peddler. So it's fascinating. And she kind of charts the role of the Jewish peddler, not only in this country, but in Europe as well. Mm-hmm. Oh, here first.
This area was, I guess, sort of a focal point in the draft riots. What was there any documentation about the Jewish role in the
There was, and I'm going to leave that aside because Howard Rock deals with that in the first volume of the book, so I want to just go on to that, but he does deal with that. Yes?
Does this coincide with the period of the Jew store in the South?
Yes, some of these people, some of these merchants are actually shipping goods to the south, and there's a lot of background. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So let me keep going a little bit with this. So as Jews rise economically, and as the city grows, there are new forms of transportation, and some of the Jews who start out in 5 Points or maybe start in a tenement in Kleindeutschland, they move uptown. And they move uptown and they create new congregations, but something roots them back downtown, and that could be stores that they want to return to for shopping. And they're also rooted back downtown often because as the newcomers are arriving, they're settling into the same places, as I mentioned. And part of the ways that these communities stay, even as they grow out of their neighborhood networks, one thing is newspapers, Jewish newspapers that tie different people together, and also charity. And I had started with the example of Passover with the Seder, so I'll keep with that. One of my favorite things that we discovered was in 1858, a bunch of a little bit over a dozen Jewish congregations, synagogues, got together to form a union of sorts temporarily. And this was a big deal because one of the things that characterized synagogue life from 1825 to 1860 was the fact that they kept fighting with each other and breaking off and forming new synagogues. So if you've ever, usually people, this isn't a surprise or we can understand that dynamic, but up until 1825, and Howard Rock writes about this, there was only one synagogue, Shearith Israel, or the remnant of Israel. And Shearith Israel, in 1825, a group broke off and formed B'nai Jeshurun. So two synagogues are still vital today, but initially broke off. And then a few years later, in 1828, another group broke off of B'nai Jeshurun and formed Anshe Chesed, and there was a fracturing. Part of it was because I like to say that people loved their way of doing things so much that they wanted to be able to create a community where everyone did things their way. And I think also what's happening in America as part of this kind of democracy and voluntarism is that everyone wants to be a president. So for every person who wanted to be a president, there's only one president per congregation. So it's funny, but I think that is part of it. Now, part of it too is that new immigrants arriving have slightly different rituals, different rites that they want to put into place. And then as the Jews move to different neighborhoods, they're going to want a synagogue in their neighborhood. So there's a lot of movement. So going back to 1858 and this union of congregations, they're all brought together because they realize there are so many poor Jews in the city that are going to go without Passover matzah. So it's up to them to kind of go beyond and step aside all past quarrels and form this union, this association for the distribution of Passover matzot. What had happened in 1857 is that there was a panic, the panic of 1857, that we don't hear a lot about because we're worried about the panic of 2008, 2007. But there was a panic of 1857, and many New Yorkers were out of work, especially the working class. And you had a rise. They anticipated or they predicted that about 10% of New York Jews needed Passover matzahs, needed charity. And what they did is then they organized and they had a matzah baker on Canal Street. So everything I'm telling you is within a few blocks away. They got a baker to make the Passover matzahs and organized and almost they didn't want people to be embarrassed. So some people did go to them and sign up, but they also kind of sent the leaders of the congregations out into the neighborhood to almost canvass the neighborhood to make sure everyone who needed Passover matzahs received it. What's great about this is that they kept excellent records that are still extant today at the American Jewish Historical Society. So for me as a historian, it was exciting to kind of see this paper, see the names of the people who signed up, the names of their wives and how many children they had. So typically you don't get all this information. And then what I did is I connected it to city directories and census records and was able to actually then look at different tenements and see who's living in a particular tenement. And often what I found was that it was Jews lived in a building with at least one other Jewish family, but beyond that, it could be a mix, right? In Kleindeutschland, other Germans who weren't Jewish, and in 5 Points, Irish families as well. So they're living in a very diverse working class New York area, but even the people who move uptown feel a sense of responsibility to those downtown and are creating these kind of charity organizations. So there's a way in which charity, if not the synagogue, charity becomes a way that uptown and downtown remain knitted together. As Jews move uptown, they need new congregations. Oops, thank you. So someone had mentioned synagogues before as the way that they would show a visiting New Yorker a Jewish life. Now this is, it's written, so I can't guess which one, Central Synagogue on Lexington and 51st Street. And this is designed in what's called the Moorish style. And I wrote a whole chapter called Moorish Manhattan because I was fascinated by this style. This is at a time in which many congregations, by the way, this congregation at that point was not known as Central Synagogue. It was known as Ahavat Chesed, Lovers of Righteousness, Lovers of Mercy. And they had started in Kleindeutschland on Ludlow Street and upstairs of a room, but they grew and they moved to somewhere which is now the East Village, and they rented a church. And this was very common. Most synagogues were churches that were rented, and about 25% of Catholic churches at the time were former Protestant spaces, or were actually former just halls that they rented and converted, because again, these immigrants didn't have much money. But by the end of the Civil War, a lot of these congregations have more money. Part of this is because of the garment industry. And just to get you the right, synagogues between 1860 and 1870 in New York State, synagogue property value increased 354%, and the seating capacity of American synagogues almost doubled. And this was certainly true for New York City. And so right after the Civil War, the first synagogue that's built is Temple Emmanuel that you had mentioned. And it was considered the first synagogue built in New York that looked like a particularly Jewish building. That's what Andrew Dolkart, an architectural historian, has said, that this Emmanuel, and Emmanuel at that point was on 43rd and 5th Avenue, so it's not the Emmanuel today on 5th Avenue. The first building in New York that was clearly identifiable as a Jewish house of worship. When it opened in 1868, the manufacturer and builder hailed it as publication, hailed it as the, quote, most important of New York buildings erected that year, and praised it as a fine example of the Moorish style of Spain and a very close copy of the Alhambra. So just at the point that these Jews are moving uptown, some of them are experimenting with Reform Judaism too, a kind of moving away from the strictness of Jewish law and and taking away some of the obligations and concentrating more on the spirit as opposed to the law. They're building buildings that stand out. No one else has more. The Moorish style is not used at all. You can see one of the things about the Moorish style are the finials, and there's all sorts of columns. And it just stood out in New York City. At that time, Catholic churches are mostly building Gothic-style buildings and Protestants Romanesque-style buildings. But the Jews start building these Moorish buildings, and they stand out. And New Yorkers, at least New Yorkers who wrote about it, really liked it. They wrote tribute. Again, as I said, the New York Times described Emmanuel as magnificent and splendid. And when Central Synagogue opened, they were really, it was hailed as something, as a testament to the tolerance and the cosmopolitan nature of New York, that it could house these Moorish synagogues. So New Yorkers who were excited about the cosmopolitan nature of the city felt that these Moorish synagogues complemented that and helped show it, and that this was a testament to, he wrote, the reporter from, I believe it was the Tribune, wrote that it was a testament to also Christian tolerance and humanity. So that these synagogues existed in New York and that they were so different shows how modern of a city New York was and how tolerant of a city New York was. So Emmanuel opens in 1868. The next year, another congregation, Sharei Tefillah, opens up also with a Moorish style, and then in 1871, Central Synagogue, actually they start building in 1871 and open in 1872. So New York, I write, is the first city that has like an aggregation of Moorish synagogues. The Moorish synagogues style had started in Europe, but what was interesting about Europe is that the Moorish style was designed by Christian architects who felt the Jews should not have a Gothic synagogue or a Gothic or a Romanesque synagogue, because that was what the churches have. The Jews should have something different. And it, in some ways, had a kind of a negative connotation. There are a lot of Jewish congregations in Central Europe who resisted that idea because they felt, I don't want this, you know, this style. This isn't this is a style that's being imposed. But in New York, the Jews embraced it. And what was so interesting is that New York Jews had been worshiping in Gothic-style buildings or Romanesque-style buildings when they had bought those churches and remade them. But they are choosing to build something that makes them stand out and look different. And it was an open engagement with modernity that wasn't just about Reform Judaism, because Sha'arei Tefillah was an Orthodox traditional synagogue, yet they embraced this as well. And one of the things that most excited me, too, in thinking about these more synagogues near each other, was that someone could go on a walk, right, and see this. And they also are seeing that there are different ways of being Jewish. There are different ways of being Jewish religiously. And some of this played out with the sermons that were given at the various synagogues. So in the 1880s, there's a series of debates. At this synagogue, Alexander Kohut was imported from Prague to become the rabbi of Central Synagogue, or Ahavat Chesed. And he was a pretty traditional Jew. So with this congregation that had been experimenting with reforms, this was a different tack to kind of go and bring someone he was a commentator on the Talmud and was much more conservative than than Emmanuel, certainly. And so they brought him over, and he settled in the congregation and starts to give a series of lectures about the importance of Jewish law. Without Jewish law, Judaism is a deformity, he says. And this sparks then Kaufman Kohler, who is head of another more synagogue, Bethel, a few blocks away. He starts giving his speeches debating this, and it goes back and forth, and it was known as the Kohut-Kohler debate. And what came of this is that people are going to all of these, filling the sanctuaries to listen to these sermons, listen to these debates, kind of, I guess, well, everyone tried to download the Jon Stewart, Bill O'Reilly debate. But this, I don't know if this had exactly that same draw, or but people were going to these, not only they were going to the sermons, but then reporters, the American Hebrew, the New York Times, were writing about what was happening as they're debating this. And Rebecca Kohut, who was the wife of, do you mind going back one? Was actually the wife of Alexander Kohut, so one of the leaders of the debate. Yeah. She was not yet married to Alexander Kohut, but she had come to New York and was listening to him speak, and she was nervous about going to one of these debates. I'll get you back. Sure. She was nervous about going to one of the debates because she thought they were going to yell at each other and it's going to be very, very tense. But she actually had a much more positive experience when she went. So I'm just going to read this while we find. It was interesting to see all those rabbis of conflicting beliefs gathered in one assemblage, listening to their respective opponents. Face to face, people cannot hate each other as much as if either side recedes into a vague symbol of menace. Here were these men, leaders all, who had to state their viewpoint for their opponents. No flights of rhetoric, no appeals to lay prejudice.
Next one?
I think, yeah. There she is, Rebecca. No, it's perfect. Face to face, people cannot hate each other as much as if either side recedes into a vague symbol of menace. Here were these men, leaders all, who had to state their viewpoint for their opponents. No flights of rhetoric, no appeals to lay prejudices and passions, no beclouding the issues were possible if these men were really sincere in their desire to arrive at amity. And that when Kohut finished his address, opponents like Kohler and Gottheil, who was a rabbi at Emmanuel, ran up to him to congratulate the antagonist. So there was something about these debates that were happening in New York as these different synagogues with different viewpoints are starting to articulate their solution to how to blend Judaism with this New York environment. And architecturally, they kind of come up with the Morris style, but then within, they're coming up with a way of defining this Judaism, and they're debating each other, the extent to which Jewish law needs to be observed, but yet there's something about New York that creates a genial atmosphere for this debate, that it's productive, because at the end of this debate, basically, Kaufman Kohler leaves, and he says, we need to articulate a defense of reform. And although this is held in Pittsburgh, it's called the Pittsburgh Platform, they articulate the main points of Reform Judaism. But it's from this debate that happens in New York. In turn, Alexander Kohut meets with other rabbis to form the Jewish Theological Seminary, which would become the center for conservative Judaism, articulate kind of a middle ground in a way between Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism. part of this is happening because of the space of New York and being able to take part in a debate that helps each side clarify what they want. Now, from an average New Yorker who is not isn't interested in necessarily becoming the leader of his own synagogue, because not everyone, even though I had said that earlier, not everyone wants to be president of a synagogue. For them, it gives them, New York allows them a space to kind of think about how these different ideas are coming together and sample. And what's also happening is that American Jewish publications are writing about what's happening in New York, and that's influencing, in part, the way that some of these trends and debates are playing out in other cities. Downtown, East European Jews are arriving, and just like the Central European Jews, they created their synagogues and their places of worship within tenements, literally, or halls, or old churches. But in 1887, a congregation called, at that point, Beit HaMidrash, but renamed itself Kahaladat Yeshurun, bought some land on Eldridge Street and built the Eldridge Street Synagogue in the Moorish style. Now, at that point, the Moorish style had become very much associated with Central Synagogue and with Emmanuel, which many of the East European Jews who were arriving, who were Orthodox, thought of as Reform. So they felt it was important to let the people of the Lower East Side know that it was going to remain an Orthodox synagogue, and the way they did that is that they had a seat contract, and it said that if we have men and women seated together, which was by 1880s becoming the way that Reform was practicing and setting up their congregations, if we have men and women seated together, you're entitled to get double the amount of money you've put into this congregation. So it was their way of assuring, even though it's Moorish can also be Orthodox, but we're, at the same time, they're engaging in the very same practices the synagogues and congregations were uptown. They knew they needed businessmen as lay leaders. They knew they had to engage lawyers. So this, creating a synagogue and building a building, led you into engaging with New York and business in a really interesting way. That's happening uptown and downtown. Mm-hmm.
2 quick questions. Mm-hmm. Is this the same time as Stephen Wise?
Stephen Wise will come a little bit later, but he also is a great orator, yes.
And the other thing is, I know Shari was not on the east side originally. He happened to be members there. I know they were on the west side. Where?
I actually don't know that for sure. The synagogues moved around a lot, so Shaarei Tzedek.
I know, they just talked about it for the holidays, and I know we completely moved.
Yeah.
And they just vaguely say the west side, but I have no clue where.
I don't remember off the top of my head, but you're absolutely right that synagogues move from place to place, and they often move, again, from a hall and then a church that they make into a synagogue. Temple Emmanuel, right? Even though they have this grand building, they started out on Clinton Street, on the second floor of Clinton Street.
The Moorish building you're talking about was...
It's been torn down.
It's been torn down.
Yes.
Clearly, we're in an old movie theater now. It's a gorgeous building.
But it's a different, yeah. So the architecture, of course, becomes a way that Jews are defining themselves to for each other, and then to non-Jews as well. And New Yorkers.
Could you just clarify that Moorish was identified with Orthodox or with?
Both. I think a lot of scholars have talked about Moorish as just being with Reform, but others are talking also about how the Moorish was used for Orthodox as well. So the second Moorish synagogue built in New York was an Orthodox synagogue that just used Moorish. So I use Moorish to talk about whether Reform or Orthodox, it's an engagement with modernity and an engagement with kind of understanding their place in New York and being willing to kind of stand out as different, and having an architecture that just popped from the street. Mm-hmm. I believe it is, yes. And that was built in the 1920s, I'm not sure. It started on the east side, also in a smaller school, yeah. Yes, and then the creation of the school and the education, yeah.
I just have one question. How many Jews came to this country around 1845? I didn't think there were that many Jews in view of the political situation, which was so different in the latter 19th century. So
right.
I was just, and who were these Jews?
Who were?
And approximately how many? I didn't think they came that early in 1845.
They did, but you're absolutely right. The numbers, large numbers, start coming with the East European Jews. But in 1880, in the United States, the population of Jews is about 250,000, and the majority of them had descended from Central European Jews. So these are Jews who are coming from German-speaking areas. At that point, before 1871, there's no Germany. It's just a bunch of different regions: Bavaria, Prussia, Baden, Württemberg. And so Jews are leaving there. They're also leaving what would become Czechoslovakia later. It was called Bohemia. So the Ahavat Chesed that created Central Synagogue, these were Jews who had come from Bohemia or Prague. So they're coming from Central Europe, not in the same numbers as the East European Jews, but enough to kind of come over and start experimenting with how do we take Judaism and how do we adapt it to New York, or broader, how do we adapt it to America. The Central Europeans who came over poor for the most part. Now, many people, when you think of a German Jew, when I first started giving walking tours, for example, and I was giving walking tours largely to the descendants of East European Jews, their perception of the German Jew, oh, they were uptown, they were rich. That was, Jacob Schiff coming down, who was a financier who actually funded a lot of wonderful organizations on the East Side. But when they arrived, when the Central Europeans arrived, they were, for the most part, and there were some exceptions, they were working class Jews arriving. But by 1880, had of course been in America long enough to make, to make a difference. At the same time, and some of the, and it's tricky because some of those who were arriving in this period before 1880, some of them were also East European Jews that were just kind of coming, early. But they were leaving Central Europe because of economic dislocation in terms of jobs that they could no longer have because of just broader industrial shifts. And that was part of a wave of, regardless of what religion you were, of people leaving. But Jews tended to migrate in higher rates. So for example, from Bavaria, Jews made up maybe 1.5% of the population, but 5% of the people migrating or emigrating from Bavaria. So they tended to come, more of them came, but there were less of them.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Sure, let's do that. So this, going to the East European Jews, and I know many of you have been to the tenement. This is not from 97 Orchard, but this is a picture of East European Jews in their tenement showing the crowdedness. The Lower East Side becomes the largest Jewish city in the world. It's also the most densely populated city in the country, some people argued in the world as well. So these East European Jews are arriving in huge numbers, and they're coming to the Lower East Side. They don't have the funds really to go beyond New York, although some do, and Chicago and Boston and Philadelphia become other cities where East European Jewish populations grow. Milwaukee is one of them. But New York becomes the center of this East European Jewish world, and especially the Lower East Side in the first years. Now, they're also arriving at a time that Americans, especially middle-class Americans, college-educated Americans, not every college-educated American and not every middle-class American, but some of them are becoming involved in what would become later term the progressive movement. And people are starting to pay attention to the terrible conditions in the cities and come down. So there's, even as these East European Jews are arriving, there are settlement house workers who are surveying the area. There are people who are arguing for housing reform, who are coming to document how these people are living, and there are people looking at how these people are working as well. Because often the garment industry was actually lodged in the apartments of these homes. Because as the garment industry grew, manufacturers felt, well, why should I house all these workers under my roof? They're coming off the boat every day. I'll give them a bundle, and the contracting system grew. So basically an immigrant says, I'm going to go into business. I'm going to use my tenement apartment. I just need $50 for a sewing machine. I've saved it up by working for someone else. I open my own business, go to the contractor, get the stuff, hire a couple other workers, and the system keeps perpetuating. 1/3 of all contractors might have went out of business in some years. I mean, it was so competitive because someone else could outbid you. But this thrived on the Lower East Side, and as negative as and it got the sweatshops, if you've heard the word sweatshops, it wasn't because it was so hot. It was because of everyone on this chain was sweating the labor out of the next level, because everyone had to somehow make a little bit of some kind of profit out of it. But the garment industry grew, and then it also went into factories, and that changed. But the conditions of many of these people, as these East European Jews are arriving, they're either going to work in a garment shop or they're going to become peddlers. or pushcart peddlers, and hopefully one day open up a store. One of the stories that we use to introduce the Lower East Side is actually talking about the building on the left, or your left, the Yarmolovsky's Bank, which is still standing on the Lower East Side. It's now a city landmark. And it looks pretty much the same as it does in this picture, except that rooftop was taken off in the 1990s because it was falling apart. But literally on the way here, I ran into Joyce Mendelson, who's a historian and preservationist, and she's working with the new owner of the building and to work with zoning laws to allow them to rebuild that Tempietto on top of the building. But what I was interested in is a bank run at Yarmolovsky's Bank in actually December of 1901. Senator Yarmolovsky had come over in 1873 originally from Eastern Europe, and then he had stopped in Hamburg and opened up a bank, and then he opened a bank up on Canal Street. So we keep going back to Canal Street. And what he did is he offered all sorts of exchange services, as was common, and he also sold ship's tickets. And when I was looking at the memoirs of immigrants who had come over, so many of them mention Yarmolovsky, that one memoir said that he was the magician of the whole migration, because everyone got their ticket or came through Yarmolovsky's bank in some way, or when they arrived, they opened up an account with Yarmolovsky and started there. So in his bank, he didn't have the money to build this bank until 1912. But before that, he had just had a 3-story building that he bought and made into this bank. And it captured my attention. And just in December of 1901, there was a run on a bank. A rumor spread that Senator Yarmolovsky's bank had run dry. And you can almost imagine this rumor going through the Lower East Side, from one pushcart to the next, from one tenement window out the air shaft to another, people shuttering their stores, closing down their carts, dropping their market baskets, and running to the bank. Where was the money that they had saved? And they all brought their passbooks, so their log that said how much should be there. And a reporter who came to talk about this, or to research what was going on, went to these people with their passbooks and said, "What is your story? Why are you here?" And one woman's name was Mary Geltman. She lived at 4 Orchard Street, so just at the base of that street. And she had saved $68 for her. She was going to be married, and she wanted a proper wedding dress, and that was part of her dowry. And then another person was a presser who was saving money to open up his own shop, or another person had been saving money so they could move to Brooklyn, the promised land. So all these people are gathering, and with all this anxiety, and their passbooks are almost like buoys in this swirl of anxiety, that's also their hopes, right? So that the bank, whoever you were and whatever you wanted, the bank represented the broader collective ambitions of these people who were coming. And it also represented the fact that they could save money after a while. As poor as things were, New York did offer work, and that work could be slack, work could get slack, it could be seasonal. But in general, there was something here in New York. They were part of the American economy through this space, as miserable and as difficult as it was, and they were saving money. I'm happy to report that Senator Yarmolovsky was able to pay back every dollar, 100 cents on the dollar. It was a rumor that was later, there was actually later a fictional account of it called Jablowski's Bank, so it was a very thinly disguised fictional account, saying that his competitors had, wanted to cause trouble for him. So the way that they started the rumor that the bank had run dry was that they went to their wives and they said, "Now I have to tell you something you cannot tell anyone." And then it spread. Now, that could have been a fictional elaboration, embroidery that started this out. But for 4 days or 5 days, people are lining up. They're waiting overnight. Mary Geltman had replaced her brother, who had waited from midnight to 6, and then she took her place for the bank to open up. At the same time, there were also some storekeepers who did not yet have the wealth of Yarmolovsky, but aspired to it, who were offering 90 cents on the dollar for the passbooks. So then not only did they then get a better account, but they got the interest for the next year that was going to go to the account. So there were people also taking advantage of the anxiety of the people who are there. So these economic niches that are set up in the neighborhood was not always, "I'm going to help you, I'm going to do everything for you." Some people felt to get ahead meant taking advantage of the anxiety of others. Sender survives that bank run. He is also a huge philanthropist, and he funds different Hebrew schools and yeshivas and hospitals. I mean, the man, and he had helped build the Elder Street Synagogue in 1887. He moves uptown to the Upper East Side, but he remains here because his business is the business with the Jews, and this was very common. Hungarian neighborhoods had Hungarian bankers, Italian neighborhoods had Italian bankers, because people trusted those people, and because a lot of American banks at the beginning didn't want to get involved with the immigrants. What money was there to be with it? But they soon established their branches on the Lower East Side as well. Let me just go through a few more things and then do questions. So the question is, why is Yarmolowski lost to history? Well, it's a good question. A banker isn't that exciting as some of other things. Also, he in 1914, he dies in 1912. So the building opens in 1912. He's there to see it opens and dies a few months after. I think it opens in May and he dies in June. His sons take over, and sadly, they did not manage the bank as well as their father had, and there were mismanagement of the bank, and there was a bank run, one in World War I, and then again right in 1917, and that one in 1917, they were done. And the bank went up for sale, and that was it. By 1920, it was up for sale. So this kind of represents the success of an immigrant business, but also the twists and turns that capitalism takes. His name is still on the bank, so even though it hasn't been a bank for many years, and different things, sweatshops and garment shops, lofts filled the space. A piano business was there for many years. His name is still there, S. Yarmolowski's Bank, established 1873. So actually, why don't we take questions now? Do that. Is that? It's 1 o'clock. Yes.
Just ask you, this time, this is all Ashkenazi Jews, right? Was there a Sephardi?
Yes.
What about, when did the Hasidim come over? Also around the time?
So the question is, was there a Sephardi presence and was there a Hasidic presence as well? So yes. First of all, some of the 24 Jews that arrive in 1654, some of them are Sephardi. But then there is, starting more in 1907, 1910, and the 19-teens, you have Jews who spoke Ladino, not Yiddish. So Ladino is in Hebrew characters, but comes more from Spanish, just like Yiddish kind of came from German languages for the most part. And they start to settle in the Lower East Side as well, some of them. But they didn't feel as comfortable because many of the East European Jews, who were by far the majority, thought, you don't speak Yiddish, how can you be Jewish? And you cook with olive oil. What's olive oil? We cook with schmaltz. I mean, so there were all these differences in daily life, and so that is part of the story. But I mean, I concentrated, and then there's a great book too by Aviva Ben-Or, who also from NYU Press, that is on the Sephardic experience in New York, and it's just fabulous. We had so much to deal with that we mentioned and we talked, but it wasn't a focus, in part because the numbers are still, in the time period we're dealing with, up to 1920, the numbers are still pretty low, given the...
Their synagogues, more
Yes, yes. Yes. Yes, what the others have are more, is more interesting. But the Moorish synagogue kind of develops first in Central Europe, in part, and one of the rationales for a long time is they felt this harkened back to the golden age of Spain, so it was coming over. But I think that architectural historians have later said that was more of a thing that was made up after the fact, and it was misinterpretation. But you're right, yeah, it is an interesting thing. In terms of Hasidim, there are some in the 1900s and 19-teens, but the Hasidic population that we're familiar with today really comes from the 1930s, because the really, really Orthodox and the people bound to their Rebbe, for example, are going to be the last to leave. They have more to lose, much more to lose by coming to America, because one of the things that's also something that everyone is dealing with is the fact that it's hard to be Orthodox in America in this time period. Even though these East European Jews, many of them arrive Orthodox. One of the hardest things is that New York is a 6-day work week, Monday through Saturday. So if you're coming for economic freedom because you're thrust out of jobs in Europe and you want to become part of the American economy, often people start to work on Saturday. And so that is a huge obstacle that we talk about in the book too. How did people kind of deal with this and grapple with it? Rebecca Kohut, whose picture was up earlier, went down to the Lower East Side to help the Jews adapt. She formed a sisterhood uptown, brought all these women downtown, went to the tenements, helped them. She writes in her memoir how some of the hardest decisions or hardest discussions she had was the truly Orthodox, usually the older generation, because the younger generation was pretty quick to adapt, but not being able to give them an answer about what they should do. And she said sometimes she sent Talmudic scholars to the sweatshop because she knew economically that's what they needed to do. But she's someone who's the daughter of a rabbi and the wife of a rabbi, and yet they couldn't come up with the solution to how to adapt to New York when economically, if you want to be viable, then that often entailed some kind of sacrifice. Now, others got around it, and there was a builder by the name of Harry Fischel who never was open on Saturday and let all his workers go on Saturday and even paid them for a half day of Saturday they didn't work. So there are these exceptions of people who kind of got around that, but that's one of the core obstacles, whether you were coming in 1840 or you were coming in 1920, and it doesn't really change until after World War II. Mm-hmm. Raphael Sawyer, yes. Let me jump to that. So this is East Side Street Scene, 1929. And Raphael Sawyer, I have to also share, is Daniel Sawyer, who's the co-author of this book. That is his grandfather was Moses Sawyer, and Raphael Sawyer is the twin of Moses, so his uncle. But we love this picture. It's the Lower East Side, 1929, and the sign, it's hard to read in here, but basically the sign there says, place for rent. The East Side by 1929, everyone's leaving. They're going to the promised lands of the Bronx and Brooklyn, and the subway system's in place, and there are no new immigrants to replenish those who have gone on. So this is a changing point. We ended our book in the 1920s in part because of the 1924 immigration quota laws that essentially stop migration. The numbers just drop so much. The Lower East Side, I think the decrease from 1920 to 1930 is huge, and basically you have a situation that by 1930, only 39% of the residents of the Lower East Side are Jewish, but 75% of the businesses are. So many of the people go to Williamsburg or go to the Brooklyn and commute back to run their shops. If you're interested in that, then you have to come to the Tenement Museum, because we're opening a new exhibit called Shop Life, where we talk about the history of the shops at 97 Orchard. But we just like this picture because it showed you the glimpse of this Lower East Side, but also talked about the change.
It's probably a great way to end there.
Thank you.
Right there. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much.